Okay, thank you for joining me today. I am looking at the book of John here, and we're going to be specifically looking at the I am the true vine verses, which is John 15, 1 through 8. And as we go through this, I think you'll find this very interesting. I think a lot of times this section of scripture has been taught incorrectly, and so we'll look at that in detail. But today we're looking at the introduction, and the introduction is going to consist of. So here I have some questions that I think are extremely important when you start a new book. And so as you see here, I ask about the author, who wrote the book. Um, Also, I actually put who write the book. But what do we know about the author? What date was it written? Where was it written from? And who was it written to? Specifically, that last one. Who is the audience? That's very, very important. So we'll look at those five. And then next week, we'll look at number 6. Why was it written? What's the purpose of the book? What it's about? How is the writer's goal accomplished? And then how is the work organized, which would be more like the outline? And then what makes the book unique? If we didn't have that book, what would we be missing in Scripture? So let's look at a very difficult question here. Who do you think wrote the Gospel of John? Well, of course, we believe it is John. And based on what we're looking at here, the issue is that John nowhere in the book identifies himself as the author of this book. And that's kind of interesting. I don't know if you have ever noticed that, but that's one thing we want to take note of. So how do we know if we're so, you know, certain about this? How do we know that John the Apostle wrote this book? Well, whenever you research the author, you have two types of evidence that are available to you. You have external evidence, which is evidence outside of the Bible. And then, of course, you have internal evidence, which is evidence that is inside the Bible. So, what external evidence do we have? Well, it's kind of interesting. There is a man named Irenaeus, and Irenaeus is a very important person, and his opinion here is extremely important because he was a disciple of Polycarp, and Polycarp was a disciple of John. And so there's not a whole lot of space between them, and therefore, whatever Irenaeus says is probably going to be based on fact that he talked to Polycarp and Polycarp talked to John and so forth. So basically, there's only one generation of Irenaeus is one generation removed from John. And then we have the church fathers. That would be your uh, men of the church in the second and third centuries. And those people are Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Origen, I'm going to Hippolotamus, something of that nature, Theophilus of Antioch, Eusebius, Clement of Rome, Cyril of Jerusalem, Papias, Justin Martyr, Augustine, and Jerome. And so our Christian fathers basically determine in their writings that Paul indeed is the author of John. I'm sorry, John's the author of John. What about what internal evidence do we have? Well, we have to look at some facts, some background facts. Obviously, the author that wrote this was a Jew, and we know that because he quotes the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament extensively. I believe, off the top of my head, he has 20 quotes uh, of the Old Testament. Sorry. The author also knew a lot about the Jewish feasts and the Jewish customs. He is continually mentioning those feasts and customs, and so that also adds to his Jewishness. the author was knowledgeable about the Jewish-Samaritan conflict. Um, so you have the woman at the well who was a Samaritan, and the kind of the argument that went between those two. And then you also have the sons of thunder calling down fire from heaven on the Samaritans when they didn't do what Jesus was asking to be done. And so he has knowledge about the Jewish Samaritan conflict. And also, and the most important part of this is whoever wrote this book was an eyewitness. And so all these important events that are recorded in the Gospel of John, they all go back to John being an eyewitness, because many times, as you see there at the bottom, it has "we saw this take place." And of course, he's including the author himself saw these things. So John was an eyewitness to the events that he recorded in the Gospel of John. Some more internal evidence. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they basically pieced together their stories, but they did it by interviewing eyewitnesses. Remember, I just said John was an eyewitness, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they interviewed other eyewitnesses to get their stories straight. So, what is the strongest clue to John being the author? And that's an interesting piece of information. You remember, I believe it's 5 times, John refers to himself as the disciple whom the Lord loved. And so, as we look at that, we can kind of get an idea that as he refers to himself as this disciple, that this is John who's speaking this. And we know that by some other questions that we can ask. But John apparently never identifies himself, so I believe he is trying to remain anonymous, at least at this point in time. So the idea of taking a piece of information and looking at it and then trying to identify who was at the table with Jesus, who was to his right hand, and so forth. That gives us a really good idea of what's taking place and who is left at the table when we look at the inner three here in just a second. So in John 13, verse 23, it says, one of his disciples, one of Jesus' disciples, the one Jesus loved, okay, we just pointed that out a minute ago, he was at the table to the right of Jesus in a place of honor. That place of honor is to the right of wherever Jesus was sitting. Now, if you take that literally, it was reclining in the bosom, and that is an idiom for a place of honor as well. So the author has to be one of the 12, okay? And also, we know that he's one of the inner circle, Peter, James, and John. So he's right there in the middle of these three. Now, Peter, when he's identified, they always use his name. So there's no question it's not Peter. And this James was actually martyred before the book of John, was written. So we know that only leaves one of the inner three. I think it's the only one that satisfies all the things we just talked about would have to be John, who is a Jew, who was an eyewitness to these things. He was a resident of Israel. He would have been a great eyewitness to these events that unfold in the Gospel of John. So, John was an eyewitness as one of the 12, and he is identified as also being in the inner three. Also, when you look at the style of writing and the various Greek words, you'll find that they match in style and vocabulary what's in 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. They don't quite match in Revelation, but that is because that was a different way of writing the apocalypse. So, according to external and internal evidence within this book, which is anonymous, it definitely points to John. So, what do we know about the Apostle John? Well, we actually know a lot. His name means Yahweh has been gracious. He has an older brother named James. His father was Zebedee, and his mother was Salome or Salome. We know that they were financially successful. How do we know that? Well, there's a couple different things here. Number one, Zebedee is in Mark 1:19 and 20. He has hired servants to help him with his fishing business. And so he was a very successful fisherman, and because of that, he had to hire servants. So we know he was very successful. John also has a family connection to the high priest. You remember that John and Peter were kind of following Christ on the way to the crucifixion and so forth, or actually on the way to the high priest's location for his trial. And John was allowed to come in as far as he wanted to, from what I can tell. But that was because of his high connection to the high priest connection. So, what do we know about the Apostle John's relationship to the high priest? Well, if we look, it's really kind of interesting. We definitely know there's a connection. And if we look at John 18:15, you see Simon Peter and another disciple, that would be John, followed them, that would be Christ and the soldiers, as they brought Jesus to Annas. Okay, now the other disciple, notice this is in parentheses, now the other disciple was acquainted with the high priest, the other disciple being John, and he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. So he actually went well into the residence there. Now, what do we know about the Apostle John owning his own home? That's kind of interesting as well. What do we base that on? Do you remember? Well, near the end of Jesus' earthly life, he was on the cross and he looked down and he saw the disciple John and he said, "Look, here is your mother." And from that time, from that very time, the disciple took her into his own home. So that tells us John had his own home and was able to look after Jesus' mother, Mary. So John comes from a financially successful family. Just think that's very interesting with all that background information. What do we know about the Apostle John becoming a believer? Now, the Apostle John was originally a disciple of John the Baptist. Now, John the Baptist, when he said, "Behold the Lamb," he pointed away from himself toward Jesus. And at that point is when John left John the Baptist and became a follower in Jesus Christ. Now, this is in Matthew, but it says, going on from there, he saw, this is Jesus, going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John. That's our John that we're talking about. They were in a boat with their father, Zebedee, mending their nets, and then Jesus called them. They immediately left the boat and followed him. So that's a little bit more background on the actual leaving to follow Jesus right there. What do we know about the Apostle John, and what was he an eyewitness to? He actually was an eyewitness to many, many different things. So as you're thinking about that, let me give you kind of a little list here. As one of the inner three, he was an eyewitness to, first one, 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John. That's his inner three, or the inner circle. He led them alone up to a high mountain privately, and there he was transfigured. So the transfiguration was a major event that John was an eyewitness to. And so only those three, Peter, James, and John, were an eyewitness to the transfiguration. Another one, he did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John. That was at the raising of Jairus' daughter, raising her from the dead. And then John was with the Lord in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he sweated great drops of blood. And so he witnessed some really, really important events. And he saw the agony of the Lord there in the Garden of Gethsemane. What else was John an eyewitness to? Well, of the disciples, only John was present at the cross, and then it was there that he received custody of Mary to bring her into his own home. But that's kind of interesting. Of all 12, only one showed up at the cross, and that was John. John was also the first one to the empty tomb. He was a little faster, a little younger than Peter, and so he was able to outrun Peter, and he got to the tomb, but he didn't go in. You remember Peter went in, then John went in, and so forth. Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, John was present to see him. Um, if you remember, there was a 40-day, after the resurrection and after the ascension, where Jesus came back and ministered to the disciples. And so he was also involved in that event. And this is really interesting. I don't know if you're aware of this, but scholars give John a name, and it's based on a word that he uses throughout the scriptures, both in John and then in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John as well. John was called the love apostle. Now, why did he get that name? I think I already told you, but it's because John spoke so much about love. And if I remember right, yeah, there it is. He used the word love, agape or agapao or phileo. He used those Greek words, and he used them 57 times just in the Gospel of John. And so that's a lot of what's there, and that's why he had the acronym Love Apostle applied to him. What did Jesus call John and his brother James? Well, it wasn't the love apostle when Jesus called them. It was sons of thunder. And that happened when there was a little bit of a disagreement with the Samaritans, and the Jews hated the Samaritans anyhow. And so these two, John and James, were going to call down thunder. And so what's interesting about that is he was a son of thunder in the beginning, but Christ basically transformed him into the love apostle. And so being in the presence of Jesus for 3 years definitely changed him. Okay. What did John become in his latter years? Well, as John got older, he became what some versions call an overseer or a bishop. He was over the church of Ephesus, and that was a very dominant church in first century times. And so Paul established the church. Timothy was over the church, and then John, as he got older, was over this church as well. And actually, he was over the churches in Asia Minor. And so, if you remember right, in Revelation, John wrote, I believe it's 7 letters. And those 7 letters were addressed to churches within that Asia Minor area that he had previously been over. And this is interesting. Another church father named Tertullian, according to him, the ruler at that time was Domitian, and he tried to kill John, and he did it by plunging him into boiling oil. And John was unhurt, and Domitian basically said, since I'm not able to kill him, I think he probably tried more than once, but this is one of the times. And because of that, he said, if I can't kill you, I'm going to send you off to the island of Patmos. And so that's how he arrived there in Patmos, and there was the perfect environment to write the book of Revelation. So let's look at the date of when John was written. Was it written not long after Jesus' crucifixion, or was it a long ways off? That makes a difference to know. Well, it had to be before AD 125, and we know this because of a man named John Ryland. He found a piece of papyrus, and he found it in Egypt, and it was dated AD 125. And so for it to get to Egypt and travel that way and all these different things, it's probably just a really recent copy of part of the Gospel of John, but it was found in AD 25. And it has the name, or sometimes you'll see it abbreviated as P52. It takes about 5 verses from John chapter 18, and that's what we see on that papyrus. Now, it also had to be after AD 68 because Eusebius says that John's gospel was written after the synoptics. And the last synoptic, which would be Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the last synoptic was written around 68 BC. So it has to be after that. So we know it's between 125 and 68, or I should go the other way. It's between 68 and 125. Most put the date between AD 85 to 95 because we know from other church fathers that it was written when John was the bishop or overseer in the church of Ephesus. And just to give you this is something on the internet that I found. This is an actual picture of that papyrus I was just talking about, the P52, the one that John Ryland found in Egypt. Okay. And so, as I said, there's some interesting history written by the church father Eusebius. It is in the book called Ecclesiastical History. And what he says, and I have some things underlined in yellow I want you to pay special attention to. But it says, and when Mark and Luke had already published their gospels, okay, they'd already been put out there, they were being shared and so forth, they say that John, who had employed all his time in proclaiming the gospel orally. Now that's interesting. So for many, many years, the gospel, at least by John, was only being shared orally. Finally proceeded to write for the following reason. Okay, so John's fixing to give, or this Eusebius is fixing to give us John's reason for writing his gospel. He says the three gospels already mentioned, which would be Matthew, Mark, and Luke, having come into the hands of all and into John's own hand, they say that he accepted them and bore witness to their truthfulness. So John bore witness to the first three gospel messages, the message in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then it says, but there was something lacking in them, an account of the deeds done by Christ at the beginning of his ministry. So, based upon what Eusebius says, the first three Gospels were already written, and then John finally wrote his, and the reason he wrote it is he felt like there were some things missing, especially some miracles, some deeds, some different things that were done at the beginning of Christ's ministry. Very interesting piece of information there. And then where was the Gospel of John written? Well, again, we're going to refer back to another church father. Irenaeus wrote a book called Against Heresies. And he quotes this way: afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who had leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel. When did he publish that gospel? During his residence at Ephesus in Asia Minor. So that puts the book pretty deep into the end of the first century, which we said was 85 to 95 AD. So the Gospel of John was definitely, according to this Irenaeus, was written in the city of Ephesus. Now here's the last thing I'm going to cover tonight, but this is probably the most important. Who is the audience that John is writing to? Is it Jew or Gentile? You know, we need to know who he's writing to, and this is very important. Because John, remember we said he was writing from Ephesus, and he was writing to those, at least those 7 churches and probably more in Asia Minor, his audience would have to be primarily Gentile. Now, how can we tell that John's gospel is written to Gentiles? Is there proof out there? Yes, there is. I want you to follow with me on this verse 4:9. It says, "So the Samaritan woman said to him, 'How can you, a Jew, ask me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink of water?'" And then John puts in a parenthetical thought here with this: "For Jews use nothing in common with the Samaritans." Well, why would he need to put that? If he was writing to a Jewish crowd, they would know that. They would know all about the Samaritans and how they don't get along. And, a Jew would never ask a Samaritan woman for a drink of water. And so he puts this thought in there, this parenthetical thought, and says, for you Gentiles that don't know what I'm talking about, this is it. Because they had nothing in common with Samaritans. And that's not the only time he does this. I believe if I'm not mistaken, I believe it was 9 times that he has these parentheses where he adds a little commentary to it so that the people reading it aren't confused. And so I think that's a very good proof that this was written to Gentiles. Now, are those Gentiles that he's writing to, are they believers or unbelievers? Now, this might surprise you, but when John wrote his gospel, okay, remember it was 85 to 95 AD, when he's addressing this, it's primarily to Gentiles who are unbelievers at that point in time. So John's gospel, I believe, is the only evangelistic gospel that we have in Scripture. The other 3 are written for different reasons, which I'll cover here in just a minute. So how do we know that? How do we know that it's written to unbelievers and it's written in order to save unbelievers? How do we know that? John is writing from this area, which we talked about, Asia Minor, lots of unbelievers and very few believers. So that's a good indication, is just the location from where he's writing from. And then let's look at another quote from Eusebius, the Ecclesiastical History. He says, among the 4 Gospels, which are the only indisputable ones, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in the Church of God under heaven, I have learned by tradition, okay, so word has been passed down, that the first was written by Matthew, who was once a publican, but afterwards an apostle of Jesus Christ. And it was prepared for the converts from Judaism and published in the Hebrew language. Okay, so this is very interesting. I'm going to look at the other Gospels. The question up here, who is the audience for the other Gospels? So I'm looking at Matthew first, since it was written first, according to this. And so who was Matthew written to? Well, that last sentence in yellow there, the converts from Judaism. So at the time this was written, Matthew was written, it was written specifically. Now, if it says converts, that would be believers. And they converted from Judaism to accepting Jesus as the Messiah and all the things that go with that. Now, who is the audience for Matthew's gospel? Matthew was written for the converts from Judaism, and a Jew that becomes a Christian is going to struggle in answering one question, and that's not only Christian Jews, but all Jews basically are looking at this. But if you're a Christian and you're a Jew, the first thing that'll be on your mind is, if Christ is the King, if Christ is the Messiah, where is his kingdom? It talks about the kingdom all throughout the Old Testament, and Jesus speaks of the kingdom as well. But we're looking at the millennial kingdom in those verses and so forth. So Matthew was not trying to lead unsaved people to Christ, but he was trying to answer a question. The question being, if Christ is the king, where is the kingdom? Now, that's an interesting question because all throughout the book you have things. There are more Old Testament quotes in Matthew. Matthew is definitely directed toward the Jewish people. Now let's look at the Gospel of Mark. What about him? Who is he written to? It's also written to the saved. Okay, that's something a lot of people don't realize, is Matthew and Mark are written to saved people. Okay. John Mark is the one who wrote it. We have been discussing this in our class on Acts, and so I put the John Mark in there just to kind of pick up on the Sunday school class. But anyhow, Mark wrote two Gentile believers, and they were mainly in the Church of Rome. That's where he was writing it to Rome. So, what do we know about the church in Rome? Well, if we look at the book of Romans, it tells us this is Paul, of course, writing. First of all, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you because your faith, that's interesting, if you have faith, or belief or trust, then you're a believer, you're a Christian, because your Christianity is proclaimed throughout the whole world. And so the church in Rome, Paul was in Rome, in prison there as well. And so through all that, and then the church came along later, the church is known for its faith. And its faith or its Christianity is being proclaimed throughout the whole world. That's how we know that the book of Mark is written to the saved. So, again, Matthew and Mark were written to believers, not trying to convert people, trying to answer questions about those different things. Let's look at Luke. Okay, who's the audience for Luke's gospel? Well, if you remember right, who was Luke written to? I think it's verse 3 in Luke says that it's written to a man named Theophilus. And so you have an individual person whose name is Theophilus. That Theo stands for God, and Philos is love. So, uh, you know, being God loved. And so that's just an interesting name that this individual had been given. Yes, it is verse 3. To write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know for certain the things you were taught. And so here again, this is a Roman person that is already a believer, and he's asking questions. It says, for the things you were taught. So Luke is written so that Theophilus may know for certain the things that they have been teaching Theophilus. So we do, again, believe this is to believers. So Theophilus is a Gentile and a Christian, and he's wrestling with a Gentile question. And that question is, if Jesus is the Messiah and Jesus is Jewish, or just let's say Jesus is a Jew, is the gospel for me? You see, after when the church first started, who was it that made up the church originally? It was all Jews. And so if you're a convert and you're a Gentile, you're going to be thinking, well, I don't know, this looks really Jewish to me. Is this really for me? Did Jesus die on the cross for me, a Gentile? And so the book of Luke is addressing that question. And so keep that in the back of your mind if you ever study the book of Luke. So we know John wrote John, and we know that his gospel is unique compared to the others. I'm not going to go into it right now, but we'll look at the difference and what synoptics means next week. But yes, John's gospel is very unique. When John wrote his gospel under the inspiration, obviously, of the Holy Spirit, his audience was unsaved. Okay, so what we've been looking at is Matthew is to the saved, Mark is to the saved, Luke is to the saved, but then John is written from an evangelistic point of view. It is written to the unsaved. Now, how do we know that? Well, in books, you have what are called, books like these, you have what are called purpose statements. Like I said earlier, we're studying the book of Acts, and Acts has a purpose statement. Actually, the outline of the book is in Acts 1:8. And so in John, we have a purpose statement. So let me read it and notice what I have in yellow there. Now, Jesus performed many other miracles or miraculous signs in the presence of the disciples, which would include John, which are not recorded in this book. In other words, there's a whole lot of extra stuff that Jesus did, miracles, that are not in the book of John. But the ones he did write about, these are recorded so that you may believe. Well, if you're writing it to unbelievers, that would make sense. If you're writing it to believers, you wouldn't say so that you may be saved. They're already saved. So these signs are miracles, and this book has the number 7 all throughout it. There's 7 signs, 7 discourses, and so on and so forth. But so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ. And so the book of John is saying, okay, let me show you how you may believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God. Let me show you these miracles. Let me show you these 7 I am statements, and so forth. And so that is the purpose statement for John. It is John 20, verses 30 and 31. There's only 21 chapters in John, so this is near the end. But once again, it says, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Okay, so I'd also like to share with you this chart. This chart came from the Ryrie Study Bible that I own, and I modified it. I added some things to it and so forth, but it's a great chart. If you're looking for a Bible, there's the Ryrie Study Bible and the NASB and all sorts of other versions as well, but I really like the notes and the outlines that Dr. Ryrie put in there. So let's look at the chart. Of course, along the top you have the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then as these authors, as Matthew wrote, how did he project Christ in his book? Well, he presented him as the king, as the Messiah. Mark presented Jesus as the servant, and Luke projected Jesus as the Son of Man. But look at John. John projects him as God. And, in the first chapter of John, we have a genealogy. We have a genealogy in 2 of the synoptics as well. But here, the genealogy takes it all the way back to God. And it's just fascinating. I'll go into the genealogy more next week. And then we have who is it written to, and I have just tried to prove these things. It is written to Jewish believers in Matthew, Roman believers in Mark, Theophilus, who was a Greek believer maybe. He's definitely a believer. And then John is the only one, again, it's different. You have believers in the 3 synoptics, and then you have unbelievers in the Gospel of John. And then how long are these? How many chapters are these? Matthew is the longest with 28 chapters. Mark, 16. He's the shortest book. Luke is pretty long as well, 24 chapters. And notice John is 21 chapters. Now here's a very interesting one. How much of that material is unique? Okay, it's different than the rest. 42% of Matthew's gospel is unique compared to the other 3. Only 7% for Mark. So Mark has a lot of the same things that Matthew and Luke have. Luke, 59%. That's pretty high, so a lot of his is unique as well. Luke took it from a doctor's point of view as well, so there's a lot of different things included that are not included in others. But look at John. 92% of John is unique. Now, if you remember from what I read from the church fathers, it did talk about Jesus had other miracles that were not included in the synoptics that John felt like should be recorded somewhere. And so 92%, I mean, it's almost all unique. And then we have something very interesting as well as the Old Testament. How many times do each of these authors quote the Old Testament? And the one you would think would be the highest that's Matthew. If he's writing to Jews, you would think he'd have the largest number of Old Testament quotes. And so 53 for Matthew, 36 for Mark, Luke is 25, and then the one that's written to Gentile unbelievers is only 20. So he has the lowest because of his audience. And Matthew has the highest because his is a Jewish audience. And then you have Matthew and Mark and Luke are all pretty close together. It just depends on who you're studying and so forth. But Matthew and Mark were probably in the late 50s, early 60s, and Luke would have been around 60 as well. But look here, we've got something different with John. John was written at least 25 years later than Luke. And so that I find that very interesting. He was a very old man when he wrote the Gospel of John. Hopefully he didn't have any memory issues like some of us do, but with the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, I think we can trust it. So that is our first round on the Gospel of John. And so if we're going to answer the questions, who wrote the book? John. What do we know about the author? The main point I want you to know about that is he is an eyewitness compared to the other three. It was written very late, near the end of the first century, 85 to 95 AD. Where was it written from? Remember, John is over the church in Ephesus later on in his life, and he wrote it at that time period. We know that from one of the church fathers as well. And so we believe it's written from Ephesus. And then who is it written to? Probably the most important thing is Gentile unbelievers. Remember, Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written to believers. And so there's a lot of unique things about the Gospel of John. Now, next week, we will look at the introduction part 2, in which we look at those last 6 questions, and our last 5 questions, excuse me. And then after that, we will move on to looking at the verses 1 through 8 of chapter 15, where Jesus says, I am the true vine. And you'll find it very interesting. There's a lot of good stuff there. All right, thanks for watching. I appreciate your time. And if you want to leave a comment, I haven't gotten any comments, but if you want to, please do. Thanks again.